Hello! Welcome to my talk, Third Time's the Charm, taking another look at Vue. My name is Ben Hong, and I'm honored to be speaking here today at Devs for Ukraine. If you're looking for me under the Internet of Things, you can find me under the moniker Ben CodeZen. With that said, let's get started, shall we? Little fun fact about me is that I absolutely love going to amusement parks and especially getting to enjoy the rides. This you see right here is the one from the Jurassic Park ride in Universal Orlando, Florida. And so if you're looking for me here playing a little Finding Wallows game, you'll notice I'm the guy up here at the very top with both of my arms up, having an absolute blast as I'm free falling 80 feet. The ride itself is really beautifully designed and again, highly recommended whether you're in Florida, Orlando, or if you're in California, Los Angeles. Either way, they both have the rides, highly recommended. A couple more things about me that you might not know about is the fact that I'm a senior staff developer experience engineer at Netlify. And a lot of the work I do in the open source revolves around the Vue community as a Vue core team member. And I'm also a Nuxt ambassador, helping to share all the goodness about Nuxt and all the amazing things that's happening. By the way, keep your eye on Nuxt 3 if you're a Nuxt fan. And then I'm also a Vue mastery instructor where I create courses around Vue. And I'm also a Google developer expert in web technologies and the Map platform. So excited to be here and chat with y'all about something that's really near and dear to my heart. So to level set and make sure we're all on the same page, let's start with the fundamental question. What is Vue? Well, if you're familiar with other frameworks such as React and Angular, Vue is often spoken of within the same sort of breath. And it's basically used to help you build user interfaces and help you manage all those things regarding complex logic, components, and all those things. But while it's also a full-blown framework that lets you build some really powerful enterprise-grade level applications, what it's also really good at, which some people might not know about, is the fact that it's also can be used just as a CDN import library, which bundles around the same size, if not less, than jQuery. And so here, there's an article here in Smashing Magazine by Sarah Drasner, who used to be on the Vue core team. And you can see here, it's about replacing jQuery with Vue.js, no build step needed. And so one of the great things about this approach with Vue is that it allows people to progressively enhance their apps who might not be ready for, say, a full-blown rewrite of their legacy app where they had a full stack application. This allows you to basically inject the CDN package of Vue and allows you to progressively enhance your apps to the point where you're ready to go ahead and make that migration. And if you're wondering, like, okay, that sounds nice in theory, but who's really done that? GitLab actually was successful in doing that migration that way. So just so you know, it's a perfectly viable way of doing things and something worth considering if you're working on a legacy code base. With that said, let's go ahead and shift now to talk about some of the things that made Vue as popular as it was. Basically, things that we loved about Vue. One of the things that Vue helped to really popularize is the idea of single file components. And so let's go ahead and recap what exactly that is. So if you're ever looking at a Vue code base, you'll notice that they're under these .vue files. And you notice there will be three different sections. The first we'll start with is the template section. You notice here we have the template element, and this contains the HTML template that will be rendered onto the page or for a specific component. In addition, on a page, what else do you have? Well, you have styling, right? So why not associate that styling with that HTML? So see here, we included a style block with the class of current count, which applies to this specific template. In addition, what if we wanted to couple logic with it as well? Well, that's easy. We also then just drop in the script block. And that allows us to incorporate reactive data, event firing, and all those things all in one file. And the beauty of doing things this way is that you're actually encapsulating and scoping all of your logic, your templating, and your styles in one file, which means that whenever it's time to delete something or move something, you know what was basically impacting the file, and you don't have to worry that something else is depending on it. Anyone who's done any migration of any legacy CSS styles will know that feeling of being afraid of moving things in one place and having it change somewhere else where it has dependencies. So that's one of the major advantages when it comes to single file components. On top of single file components, one of the things that made Vue very popular is the Options API. And so what is the Options API? Well, let's go ahead and take a look at this script block up here at the very top. Let's focus in on it. What you'll notice here, though, is that it's a script block where it's exporting a default object. And inside of this object, we have a bunch of basically different configurations. So if we pay attention here, you'll notice that there is this data and methods option, right? Data is basically a place for you to store all of your reactive data that Vue will track for you and make sure that it updates using its reactivity system. And then in the second one you see here, you have your methods, which basically are functions that you can call within your component that will be basically connected with the rest of your component. And the reason this is called the options API is because, as you can see, what you're essentially doing is you're configuring an object with various options regarding how the component actually works. And this was actually a very elegant solution for helping people to provide guardrails on how to write their components and organize their components in a very consistent way. So every time you walked into a component, you knew exactly where to look for different things. The other thing about Vue that I really love, and I think a lot of people have loved, is this idea of computed properties. And I think it's one of those hidden gems that not as many people are aware of. And really, in my opinion, it's basically reactive data in one of its most reliable forms. All right, so to take this example here, we have a component here that's tracking the count, and a lot of times we know that data has a lot of dependencies. So let's go and take that look in sort of more abstract example. So first off, we have like a count, right? This reactive piece of data. And let's say you want to have something that doubles that count. Well, to do that in most frameworks, it's fairly straightforward, right? You have your reactive data for count, and then you have something watch that data to update another piece of data that then goes ahead and based on like the update of the count, then it'll double that count. Fairly straightforward, right? But then as we know, applications grow more complex and that dependency chain can get pretty complicated. What if we also had another piece of reactive data where we had an item? And from that item, we can go ahead and derive a price. And then when we combine the price with the count, that's where we can go ahead and say, yes, this is the total that we need to render out to the user. And then on top of that, that's just the beginning, right? What if we also then wanted to account for the fact that, hey, there's also the location that the user is in, which then we'll go ahead and factor into some sort of tax property, which then we'll also want to factor into the calculation, which is then the total. After a while, you get a pretty complex network of dependencies, and especially if you're managing your reactivities like independently or manually, you'll notice you have to make sure you invalidate the right things at the right time. You have to be careful about what's caching where, because if you don't cache correctly, you'll have performance issues because things will be rendering when they're not supposed to, or things will trigger as you're not expecting. And so you can imagine when you have these really complex pieces of data, especially on things like data visualizations, it's rather unrealistic to expect a developer to hold this entire workflow in their head and figure out what to invalidate, what to cache, and so forth. And so one of the things Vue did was basically come up with a pretty elegant solution for how this works. So you have your reactive data here, right? Here we have the count. Well, how do we do that? Well, we have this idea of computed properties, which is, in other words, these are things that are derived from the source of truth. In other words, your reactive data. So how might this look? Well, we have double count, which is a function, and the function then will go ahead and basically return a value that's calculated based on the dependency to the original count. And so because of this, every time count updates, double count will go ahead and update accordingly, be cached correctly, and then render accordingly and performantly to the rest of your application. And what's even better is that computed properties not only work with other reactive data, as we see here, but you can actually combine it so that it works on other computed properties. So you can build these really intricate chains of dependencies and not have to worry about it, because as long as you update count correctly, all your other properties will be updated exactly as you expected and cached exactly as you expected. So one of the things I absolutely love, and just wanted to share that with you. So once you have your computer properties, it's like, it totally frees the way you think about data, because it allows you to really focus on what's important, which is the logic and building a really beautiful application rather than having to basically manually invalidate and track every single dependency. So happy dance for those who have used computer properties with success and know just how easy it makes the mental model of managing your reactive data. Okay, with all that, that's sort of some of the highlights of what make Vue what it is. And of course, if you hadn't heard, Vue 3 was released a little while ago, actually. It's a year or so now. And pandemic time, right? It completely distorts the way you perceive time. And Vue 3 was a really big deal because, we had Vue 2 for a long time, and a lot of people were thinking like, where is Vue 3, right? We want to see some updates. We want to have some new features. And so, in case you can't see the GIF here, here is Steve Carell from The Office, where he is, where are the turtles? And so we had a lot of that. We had a lot of, where is Vue 3? And when can we get all these new shiny things? But we did release, and so I want to talk to you about some of the things that have come with Vue 3, hence why we're talking, hence the talk of the title, Third Time's a Charm, taking another look at Vue 3. Because there might be some new things in Vue 3 that might change your mind about whether Vue is a framework you might want to give a shot. All right, so the first thing first, when you talk about Vue 3, you almost can't talk about Vue 3 without the composition API, because this is basically another way of authoring your components and managing logic. So I'm going to go through a high level of what that means and how that looks in comparison to the options API that we took a look at earlier. All right, so first thing first, here we have a single file component. You'll see here inside of the script that we have the data here that's tracking the count. And then we have this computer property of text color, which goes ahead and based on whether the count is even or not, will return a string of red or green. And then you have a method here to increment the count accordingly. And then inside of our template here, you'll see that we have a standard H1 with a standard counter. And then we have a P tag with a inline style to actually change the color of the actual paragraph tag based on the current count. It'll render out the count. And the button here will go ahead and increment the count as you would probably expect. Now, one of the things about Options API, while it's really beautiful and elegant in its way of like placing railguards and making things very consistent for people, is that some people wanted more freedom in terms of how they author their components, right? What if they didn't want to put things in data, computed, and methods? What if they wanted to arrange things as they saw fit? Well, the composition API is basically the answer to that sort of more opinionated structure. So what we do here is we start by using the setup lifecycle method, which basically is a lifecycle method that happens at the very beginning of the component and allows us to do some pretty interesting things, which we'll see shortly. So the first thing first is how do we move the reactive data that we have here, count, into setup? Well, everything inside of setup is ultimately vanilla JavaScript. So this is where we're getting back to the raw, like if you want freedom and you get all the tools at your disposal, this means now we're really in the point where we're in free JavaScript land. So we have a constant of count 0. Now, don't worry, this const though is just a regular constant. There's nothing magical about it. And so in other words, we got to tell Vue that this is going to be a reactive data property that we wanted to watch. How do we do that? Well, we do this in a declarative way by importing a helper method from Vue called ref. So in other words, think of it as a reactive reference. This is how we differentiate between a standard constant and something that's going to be tracked by Vue. So here we have a const count where it's a reactive reference and we're tracking this 0. Next, what if we want to move our computed property into it? How does that look? Well, again, we're in JavaScript land, so we'll create a constant of text color, and then just like ref, we'll import a helper method called computed, and this will be a function that returns the value that we're looking for. So the logic is the same. It's the count value, and we're looking to see whether it's even or not. And we're looking to see if it's even or not. And if it is, we return red. Otherwise, we return green. And finally, what is the method? A method is ultimately just a function that does something, right? So similarly, this is a const of increment count that we can use the arrow function to declare. And we basically say, hey, in this function, all we're going to do is we're going to increment count's value. Now, the final step to all this, though, is that because everything's in vanilla JavaScript, we need to define what we're actually going to expose back to the component, kind of like an API. So at the end of all this, what we're going to end up doing is we're going to return an object that contains all the properties we want to expose. Because after all, when you're writing your JavaScript, sometimes you have things that you might want to be private or you might not want to be exposed. So this allows you that sort of manual configuration of what's going to actually be exposed back to the component. And so as you can see here, we have vanilla JavaScript and it works exactly as it did before in Options API. But here you're really in JavaScript land. So this is something you have to be really comfortable with. Now, of course, some of you are probably immediately thinking of the question, the $1 million question, which is on everyone's mind, which is like, does that mean that like Options API is dead and Composition API is the future? Honestly, I have a whole talk devoted to this and I don't have time for a whole thing, but what I want you to know is that while it might seem like the two are at odds with each other, I do think that there is a place for both, and depending on your use case and how you're writing your components, you might find yourself choosing one in one scenario and choosing one in another. But again, that's for another topic another time, but just know that both methods of authoring your components are still valid in the Vue ecosystem today. Okay, so let's talk about developer experience, because one of the things that Vue 3 does is that in addition to thinking about how can we also improve the ability of our developers to write and author components in a way that suits them, we also want to make their lives easier as well. And so in Vue 3.2 and onwards, we introduced this idea of script setup. So what does that mean? So here we're back to the component that we talked about earlier, right? As you can see here, we have the exporting the default object, but then everything here is in Composition API. And so that's part of it. Some people in the ecosystem really love Composition API. They want to be pure Composition API. But as we can see here, there's a fair amount of boilerplate that's happening, right? Because every time you define something you want to expose to the component, you got to return it. And so, people kind of got this feeling of like, oh, like I got to write boilerplate every single time. This is tedious, right? That's the last thing we like to do as developers. We don't want to write boilerplate. And if you can't see the GIF, this is a turtle who's just like falling flat on his face on the way down. And so how might this look? We thought about the developer experience for this, and we said, I think we can make this better. For those who want to be pure composition API, let's change it up a little bit. So the first thing first, let's go ahead and move this setup lifecycle hook into as an attribute of the script tag, because what this is going to do is tell the compiler that this entire script block is going to be basically run inside of the setup lifecycle hook. And so this is the first piece we want to do, because we can assume that, right? If you're pure composition API, you're not going to be using anything else in the options API. You're just going to be using setup. As a result, you don't need to export a default object anymore. So once again, a little more boilerplate starting to disappear. And finally, because of some compiler optimizations, what we end up getting is you don't even need to define what's being returned. If we see it's being used basically within the template, we can figure it out from there and make sure everything is bundled and packaged accordingly as you would expect. But at the same time, look at how much more concise this is, right? And it's like, yo, that was awesome, right? Because now you got this thing where you're defining all this stuff in vanilla JavaScript. It looks very clean, declarative for those who love that style. And then you still get all the power and benefits of what makes Vue amazing. So I know a lot of people are super excited about it, and a lot of people authoring things these days have already bought into the script setup way of writing components. And I'm very happy for them. All right, so what else is there? Well, something that's worth mentioning here is that the TypeScript experience with Vue. In Vue 2, we had a little bit of trouble when it came to integration with TypeScript because, well, Vue 2 wasn't written in TypeScript. So when it came to exporting types or integrating, people had some problems. But with Vue 3, that's no longer the problem because we now have improved TypeScript support. Because Vue 3 was rewritten entirely in TypeScript, which means going forward, you can expect improved tooling support, and there is much better support in official libraries for types and those things. But most importantly, one of the things that makes Vue I've always treasured about Vue as far as ethos goes, is the idea that we let you choose what's best for you so that you can decide how you want to build your application, and then you get to do your own thing. And an example of this is where, you know how we're talking about single file components and the template has HTML? If you want to use JSX, you can totally use JSX instead of template blocks inside of your single file components. But that's once again, a whole nother conversation. But again, this is really important to me as far as Vue's ethos of letting you choose what works best for you. And so as a result, even though we have all this stuff typed to scope ready for you, this is 100% opt-in. So I just want to stress that it's not a requirement for use it, but the moment you do, know that the ecosystem is here for you. All right, so with that, there comes a So here's a little me here. If you can't see it, it's a turtle here eating mashed potatoes, and it says, "Oh my God, mashed potatoes," and it's having the time of its life. And so if there's one feature that I'm really excited to tell you about when it comes to Vue 3, is this concept of dynamic styles. And so what do I mean by dynamic styles? Let's go ahead and take a look at our component, shall we? So we're back here inside of our current count, basically our little standard counter with the ability to change the color based on whether the count is even or odd. Now here's the thing, right? If you look closely, you'll notice that on the paragraph element, the way we're changing the color is we're doing basically a dynamic style attribute bind, which will dynamically update the inline style of color based on whatever text color is. And so that's a common way of dealing with dynamic styles. But this feels a little hacky, especially because at some point this becomes tricky to manage. Inline styles don't scale very well. So how might this be better? Because one of the things I've always loved about Vue is that we do our best to leverage what you already know, what works best. So in other words, we took HTML and we said HTML works as it is. Let's sprinkle on a little bit of magic, some directives, some vbind and those sort of things in order to make it work even better than before. And at the same time, we want to also use what makes CSS powerful, right? Why inline everything with HTML and just JavaScript? So in an ideal world, what we have a style block inside of this component. And let's say we have a class of current count. And what we'd want to do is we want to move this dynamic color inside of the CSS, right? And then what would end up happening here is that we'd go ahead and bind, right, our class current count, but then the text color would go ahead and automatically update everything that's inside of the CSS so that it's dynamic. And this way we leverage what makes CSS very powerful while still making use of what makes JavaScript really powerful in terms of dynamic values and those sort of things. Well, I'm here to tell you this doesn't work, right? If you write your code inside of Vue 3 or 3.2 and above like this, nothing happens. In fact, you're probably going to get an error. On the other hand, though, if you go ahead and you wrap your value, though, in this vbind, call it like command, and you pass in the variable that you're looking for, believe it or not, this works. And so you're probably wondering how, like, I don't believe you. Show me how this works. All right, so let's go ahead and switch on over, shall we? Let's do a live demo. Okay, so here we can see this is the same code that we had earlier. And here we have the standard counter. You'll notice that when I add it, it switches color. This is great. And so if we go ahead and inspect this inside of our Chrome DevTools, we'll see that the color is actually being switched here, right? Color red, color green. This is what we expect. Now what we want here then is to go ahead and let's try out this new dynamic style that I told you about. So we have current count. This will be, and let's just go ahead and switch it to color blue at the moment, just to make sure this works. So we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna replace this inline style with a class of current count. And then you'll see here, there you go, it's blue now. But what we want is for it to be managed by JavaScript. How do we have our CSS managed by JavaScript? Well, the way we're gonna do this is we're gonna vbind the text color. And so, once we do this, you'll see now that it'll update and everything changes as expected. Now, you're probably wondering, how does this work, right? This looks like black magic. Well, the way this works is the fact that actually what's going on here is that when what you're binding inside of the CSS, it's actually using CSS variables. And that's what's actually being updated in line on the style here. And you can see it even has a unique hash so that you prevent basically clashing with other naming. And so now when you update this, you can see everything changes and updates as you would expect. And this is really powerful because, you know, I know that CSS is kind of a controversial topic when it comes to front end, but let's be honest, when it comes to CSS, it was designed with a cascade for a reason, and that can be extremely powerful when utilized correctly. And so if we can leverage CSS variables that's natively built into browser technology, and then with all the benefits of JavaScript reactivity, we have some basically infinite possibilities when it comes to how we might let users actually customize things that's scalable and maintainable for us. Because in other words, if we were managing this app and we wanted to let users choose what colors they prefer, this would be rather tricky, right? Because you're not going to store a string of everything. But what if you wanted to let people pick the color, but you don't want to have to like manage everything yourself and you want to be able to share how things are? Well, one of the things we could do, for example, is let's go ahead and do this. We can go ahead and do an input and let's say type color. And I'll just go ahead and bind this using the vModel directive to a thing called user preference. And then we'll just do it like that. And then I'll go ahead and create a new one called user preference. And user preference is going to be a string, empty string like that. And to show you this is working, we're going to go ahead and just render this out. So let me go ahead and actually do that up here. So we're going to do that, and we'll do user preference. So it's an empty string right now, but you'll notice that when I switch this, the hash, basically the hex color is being updated as expected. Now that that's being updated, we can actually go ahead and update here with user preference. And then you'll notice, oh, you can't see it here, but we'll see here when we go and update, our text color is actually being updated exactly as we expect. And this just has so many implications because now we can also do things like using native CSS, like, well, you know what? We want all our buttons to also have a background color of the vbind user preference. And then there we go. And so now you can see that when we switch it, everything is updating as you would expect. And so if you scale this across modules, state sharing, there's a lot of fun things you can really do with this. So anyhow, that is my big, I absolutely love the developer experience of this in its ability to leverage technology for what it's good for, and then combining that together in a way that keeps true to what it's, that keeps true to those technologies. All right, with all that said and done, I know I've thrown a lot at you today, but honestly, my main point at the end of all this is, you know, if you're starting a new side project or just testing things out and want to learn new things about how things might be done, honestly, I think it's worth giving Vue 3 another try and seeing if that might be a good fit for you. Because I think that's one of the things, honestly, I love. Even though I'm a Vue core team member, I think the web is about learning from one another, right? We see all the different frameworks and they come out with various good ideas that really help to push the ecosystem forward. So, even though I'm a Vue core team member, I always like to see what other frameworks are up to, because at the end of the day, I think we're all trying to do the same thing, which is to build these amazing user interfaces that help to solve people's problems and basically help move the world forward a little bit at a time. So with that said and done, thank you everyone for spending the time to chat with me today. My final turtle meme for the day is here. You can see this happy little turtle. I am a pretty, pretty butterfly, and that's what it says on the meme. But once again, if you're looking for me on the Internet of Things, my website here is at benkozen.io. You can find me under a lot of the different social media platforms, but specifically if you're looking for me on Twitter, YouTube, Twitch, I do live streaming and record videos. Again, you can find me under the moniker benkozen. With that said, thanks again everyone for having me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Till then.